Hi, everybody. Today is Sunday, January 25th, 2026, and our dear friend Alastair Crooke is here with us. Welcome back, Alastair.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Please hit like button and follow Alastair on his Substack called Conflicts Forum. You'll find a lot of information, a lot of stuff there about the West Asia, about Europe, about what's going on with the foreign policy of the United States. And Alistair, let me start with what has happened in Iran, here in Iran, in the last 2 weeks, basically. We had the recently in the World Economic Forum, we had Scott Bessent, US Treasury Secretary, talking about how they have done everything to collapse the Iranian currency and make, to push these people to bring this sort of suffering to the Iranian people. And then somehow manipulate the situation in Iran. I was watching the protests, and the government was trying to communicate with the elites of the market, with the economists, to bring the tensions down. Then it came the protest coming. The protest turned into riots. They were burning, banks, somehow, you know, fire trucks. A quarter of the ambulances here in a large city like Tehran were somehow destroyed, which was amazing to see. And you see a huge manipulation, not only inside the country. As I was watching what's going on in the mainstream media outside of Iran, you see the reality is totally different. They were preparing from outside for the United States or Israel to attack Iran. From your point of view, how did you find the whole case of these, unrest in Iran, protests, riots, and then America being moments away from attacking Iran?
Um, first of all, I was looking at it from the point of view of trying to get a clear understanding of the reality of what was going on. And, there were really two phases to this. There was the phase in June. And in that time, there was a surprise. It was a surprise, if you like, a surprise attack, because Trump had just announced that there was going to be negotiations with Iran 2 days later. The attack was on Friday, the 13th of June, and on Sunday, Witkoff and the team was supposed to be in Oman to renew negotiations with Iran. It was a deception. It was intended to put Iran off guard. And what happened then on that day was a surprise attack. This was different from what has happened now, but there were the insertion of small covert units into Iran. These were small units, cells rather than units, small cells, and they were equipped with attack drones and also strike anti-tank missiles. And their objective and their purpose was to try and destroy, though they were placed close to the early warning radars in Iran, the eyes and ears of the main radar system. Not, this was just the localized radar system, and they did destroy some of it. But it did take the IRGC aerospace people, I think, by surprise because, they didn't know. I mean, they were suddenly under attack and they didn't know where it was coming from. I mean, and then it took a few hours or best part of a day for them to realize that this attack was coming from within Iran, and people using, they were very close to the sites they were attacking. They were using, as I say, anti-tank weapons and small drones coming in a suitcase. It was smuggled in to Iran for this purpose. And it took a little time for them to realize, and then they took the remedial action of cutting off the internet. And that severed these cells from the data and targeting information which was being provided from the array of satellites that America has that produce, if you like, a simulated battlescape, in the cloud, which they were transmitting data up to the moment, data of the positions of radar, Iranian radar, down to these cells for them to target. Well, the internet cutoff stopped that. Then the thing morphed into the, if you like, the second stage after the decapitation strike on the commanders and on the political leadership and the assassination of some scientists. And then it went into the second stage, which was what is called the 12-day war. I don't want to go into that beyond saying that after about 4 days, Israel asked Trump to agree and arrange a ceasefire because they were being attacked like they've never been attacked before, and their air defense systems were proving inadequate to protect Israel from the missile attack. Then, when we come to the present period, this period now that has just passed, this was a different sort of attack. This was a different surprise that was being organized. This was the insertion of trained rioters into Iran. Some of them were Kurds coming in who'd been trained either in Albania in the Camp Sar or in Iraqi Kurdistan. I'm not quite sure which. And some of them were MEK that had been at the camp in Albania, where 3,000 MEK are under training by the CIA for precisely this sort of job. And then there were others that came in as well. These were organized and directed. They came in and they were told where to go and what to do. But their playbook was, I think, also somewhat unexpected, at least to me. Anyway, this was, you probably remember it, the famous tome, which was The Management of Savagery. I don't know who wrote it, but I am told it was possibly an Egyptian. But this was the ISIS manual of creating absolute fear and disruption in a society by unrestrained savagery, unrestrained violence. And this has been the ISIS, if you like, text that they have used throughout. And the aim of it was the violence was extreme, and the attacks were on things that you wouldn't expect, on banks and mosques and all the elements of the state. And they attacked innocent Iranians as well, viciously and in a really brutal way. The images I've seen of some of these attacks, and it was all intended to convey the message of a complete sort of a crumbling, burning edifice of the Iranian state, that it was on fire, it was burning, it was coming apart, and everyone was fleeing the building. And that into this was supposed to come, as Netanyahu and the Israelis, I think, had persuaded Americans to come in that situation where the house was on fire. And that people were fleeing out of it because of the danger that they felt, and the thing was just crumbling, the building crumbling as it burned. That it would be an easy job. They would, with a small military operation, they would come in, assist the rioters, and that the state would implode, collapse, and would be finished. And Iran would then be rather like Syria was after Mr. Assad left Syria. So they wanted to achieve, that was, from my perspective, what was the aim of it to be achieved. And it failed. And it failed, I believe, for a number of reasons. But the first of which I think was that, again, Iran responded very quickly to cut off international telephones, to move from the international internet to an internal network internet that was just served the government and those in Iran, but severed the links to the external world. But then, crucially, and this was the surprise that came to the Israelis and to the CIA, which they hadn't expected, the big surprise was the severing of the Starlink. I'm told some, you know perhaps better than me, but some 40,000 terminals have been smuggled into Iran. And this was the mechanism for directing this whole operation. They needed that and the internet to tell people where to go, how to operate, how to come together. And I think behind the scenes was also another plan, which was the balkanization of Iran. So the Kurdish element coming into Kerman Shah province in Iran was being directed to set up a constitution and a structure for a separatist state inside Iran, and others too. I mean, I don't know if the Baluchis were doing this or not, but clearly this was part of the plan of Israel more than the United States. The United States was still thinking in terms of regime change, and that Reza Pahlavi would come in and take over. But that was never the Israeli plan. The Israeli plan was balkanization and the division of the state into ethnic, weak components, just as we see has happened in Syria. But the Starlink really, after that, I think the turning point was about that Thursday or Friday of the previous week. And then the whole, if you like, the unrest just subsided almost totally within a day or two and was gone. And that came as a surprise. And the import of this was really quite important. And it has even been recognized by, Israelis. I mean, those that are professional and not propagandists. They looked at it and they said, well, look, according to the plan, but where was the defections by the political elites from parliament defected and joined the protesters? Who defected from the army, from the IRGC, from the Basij? Nobody. I mean, there was nothing of any substance. There was no real opposition in Iran, and there was no, if you like, fragmentation, fracturing of the structure of the state. The state emerged from this intact. And the Israelis now, pretty much in their intelligence assessments, admit that. I was writing today about things, and it was quoting Roland Bergman, who said the assessment was that the insurrection just didn't happen. It stopped, and it even goes on to say, the question is whether it was ever likely or whether it was ever going to succeed. I mean, saying, well, trying again isn't going to work. I mean, that's quite an important, analysis by the Israeli formal intelligence assessment of it. Whether that has percolated through to Washington sufficiently, that, of course, is a different question, because Washington is still stuck in very much in certain frameworks of thinking and certain frameworks of understanding of Iran. But I mean, I think just recently the outgoing head of Mossad went to see Trump, David Barnier. Of course, we don't know what he told him, but I suspect that Trump does know that it was a failure. Of course, they're trying to compensate for it now. I mean, there's the coping going on, and the coping is, well, of course, we didn't actually deploy lots and lots of forces to the area, and maybe now we're having to deploy lots of forces to the area because that was clearly a mistake. That was, we needed more to make it work, and we didn't have them on place. So it's really just, I think, more than anything, a coping mechanism, because the military experts, and I've quoted this in the article I wrote, the military experts who I respect, people like Will Scriver, and others who really know it, say, we've been again propagandized that, a massive force is on its way to the region around Iran, and that there are ships and forces and missiles being. And he says, this is just, they say it's the largest force ever assembled in the Middle East since this war or that war. And he says this is just arrant nonsense. It's not true. At the most, the ships and the formations that are arriving offshore Iran, there would be plus or minus perhaps 350 Tomahawk missiles that could be fired from the ships, because they can't replace them once they're fired, because many of them have to go to port to be reloaded. And he says, 350 over Iran, the size of Iran, and with Iran's missile systems being dispersed right across the country, a country that's the size of Europe. I mean, 350 Tomahawks, yes, they can do a certain amount of damage. Are they going to destroy Iran? No. So, is it a bit more, is this again more of a sort of coping mechanism to try and please Trump in case he decides that he wants to finish the job as the Israelis? But I think the things that are really important is that, I mean, Trump, I think, probably understands that the intelligence was flawed, that Iran was a house of cards, and just a simple push, this insurrection would topple it easily, and then a small force could, as Trump likes to say, in, boom, out, very quick, and finish, clean operation, and a big win, standout event. It's brilliant, but maybe that's not so easily had. It's not Venezuela. It's not going to be a sort of Maduro type of operation where a few Delta Force operatives come in and seize the president, and the next day he's in a court in New York. It's not going to happen like that. And even the Israelis admit that they didn't know they'd wanted to try and assassinate the supreme leader in an earlier round, but they couldn't find him. So, this I think is where we are at the moment, in the chaos, in the sort of remaining chaos of Davos and Greenland and all the other distractions, and of Zelensky lecturing the Europeans on their deficiencies. after Howard Lutnick and Besant had also told the Europeans how useless they are. Not that I'm disagreeing with the thrust of his observations, but I'm saying that it was a crazy, crazy sort of period. But then, of course, we see what has happened on Greenland, what is left of NATO, what is the future of the European Union as it exists. All of these, it's a bit too early to say for sure. I mean, what is the meaning to all of
One of the important key points that you mentioned is the attempt, endeavor on the part of the Israelis, together with this network of intelligence, to make some sort of fracture within the government, within the administration, within the leadership here in Iran. One was after the cut of the internet, they said that the Iranian government is using chemical weapons against the people here in Iran, the same strategy they have used in Syria against the Assad government with those false flag operations. And the other thing that was somehow amazing to me, that they said that Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister of Iran and the former vice president of Iran, is in contact with Reza Pahlavi, and he's giving his messages to Reza Pahlavi and giving and bringing some sort of messages from Reza Pahlavi to Rouhani. And do you think that we have been facing some sort of, all the experience from Maidan, from Ukraine 2014, then go to Georgia, then go to, Syria? It was somehow, it's a combination of all of them together, it seems to me.
Yes,
What is your understanding of that?
no, I think, that this has been long planned. That's been in the works for a long time. And we can see that from the fact that the people that were inserted, I mean, they knew exactly what to do. And they were directed to areas mostly in sort of small cities initially where there would be crowds. And then they could ignite the crowds. And then there were people with guns and snipers who would fire at the security people. And the security people, I mean, there's a sort of myth in the world by people who have never been under fire that, you know where the shot is coming from. Oh, it's coming from up there. It's nonsense. By the time you hear the shot, the bullet is already in you or past you. I mean, you don't actually know where it's coming from. So, I mean, it was all an accumulation of the elements that were present. And it was focused, of course, first of all, on the economy and on the crashing of the real in Dubai. The short selling of the real set off a real emergency for the bazaris and for the merchant class, because their business, a few percent drop in the value of the real, one thing, but that huge drop, I think 40% or maybe even more, I mean, just eviscerated their business models. It wasn't that they were upset with the state per se, although they were certainly not happy with the economic management, the legacy of mismanagement of the economy as they understand it in Iran. And indeed, I was quite puzzled why, it's very easy to organize a short selling raid on a currency if you have money. I mean, enough money, you go in and you just sell and sell and sell, and you make money in the end of the day because then you buy back later on. And I couldn't understand why there wasn't some arrangement, a swap agreement with China or something like that, that the government used to bring the currency back up to a level. I know there are, the foreign reserves of Iran. Many of them are still frozen. But I mean, China's offered to give financial support. But it seems over this period, I don't know, I'm speaking in ignorance, but over this period, the successive governments have not, approached China and made those sort of arrangements that they're normal arrangements. Russia is often under currency attack, a short selling attack. Remember, at one point they'd actually taken it to such a limit that the value of oil actually went negative for a few days. So I mean, and then there are these arrangements between central banks, and I can't understand why that happened, but it does remain a sort of vulnerability. I mean, I hope that perhaps Iran would call in the Chinese and say, please, sort out the economic the situation, because it's very difficult. Iran is going on with a mix of two quite contrasting and oppositional economic structures. On the one hand, during that earlier period, the Rouhani period, we went sort of neoliberal in Iran and tried to get rid of subsidies and sort of have a proper, as they would say, a market economy. But first of all, that is not something that is easy to do, because you can't just rip away, the floor to prices of flour and other key elements in the economy. And then the other part of it is a social economic structure, rather like there exists in China and in Russia, where it is not about individual businessmen making as much profit as they possibly can, but an economy that is geared, and its investment strategies geared to the community as a whole. Anyway, that's for Iran to sort out in when all of this passes over and have time to sort of rethink it. I don't know why it happened. I mean, perhaps there was a tension between people who looked east and people who looked west. But whatever it was, I mean, it certainly flagged up the fact that this is something that has to be addressed very seriously.
Yeah. You've mentioned the case of Greenland, which was one of the hottest, you know, talking points at Davos at World Economic Forum. Donald Trump wants Greenland, and Europe doesn't know how to deal with that, doesn't know how to understand the situation with the current policy of the United States. Is when you look at Greenland, when you look at the way that Donald Trump and JD Vance are talking about Greenland and the future of NATO, and these countries have sacrificed, European countries have sacrificed a lot during the war in Ukraine. The German economy is in a huge, they're dealing with a lot of difficulties right now. And on the other hand, you see the German chancellor coming out and saying that we're going to protect Denmark and Greenland from Russian threat, while Donald Trump is talking about Greenland. And the text message from Emmanuel Macron saying that we are all in for the case of Iran, but let's ignore the case of Greenland. It doesn't seem that Donald Trump would give up on the idea of somehow capturing Greenland. What is your understanding? What is your take on the way that Europeans somehow trying to manage the relationship between Europe and the United States?
Well, managing that relationship between Europe and the United States, I mean, I don't think will ever be as it was. It's changed. It's broken, and I think there was a meeting of the European Council, which is the heads of state, on Thursday, and that was generally the consensus. There's no real way back to the relationship that used to exist between Europe and the United States. And of course, that bears on NATO and the whole question of NATO as it stands. The Greenland thing has a curious history in the sense that it was in I think Mr. Bolton has said that it was in 2018 that a billionaire proposed to Trump that he should buy Greenland. And then in 2019, first term Trump, actually tried to buy Greenland. He did go through this, and it failed. But since then, of course, actually, what did Europe do about Greenland or the fact that Trump had tried to buy it? Nothing. I mean, they just carried on without, improving the situation in Greenland. And Greenland then left the European Union because over fishing rights, because they wouldn't accept, because Greenland exists on fishing, and the fishing policy of the European Union threatened them. So now, to what extent did the suggestion of Greenland have a strategic interest? Well, this is my personal opinion, but I think that that's all nonsense. I mean, there's no question that Russia or China is about to take over Greenland. I mean, Greenland is sort of a kilometer thick ice pack, basically. And yes, it has got minerals under it, but these minerals are almost inaccessible except around the coastline, close to the sea. But I mean, the cost, with the getting through the ice to extract minerals, and then there's no transport system or ability, will machinery work in these sort of, extreme temperatures? I don't think there was any sense. Americans have had an agreement with Greenland since '51 to allow them to establish bases there. They have early warning radar system on Greenland. They have missile bases on Greenland. It's not as if they haven't got them. They don't. They've had them there for years. So I think sometimes we can sort of overanalyze these things. I mean, the reality is that, America has been quite used to buying territory. It bought Alaska from the Russians. It bought Louisiana before. And Trump has had a look at the map and he thought, well, that would fit in quite nicely with us. And what's more, I would be able to say to the Americans, look what I've done, unlike, other presidents. I mean, this is even bigger than Alaska. We've added more territory than even the Louisiana Purchase, which was much bigger. And, if we take Greenland, look at the map, it will be part of America. And so I think it's and he said, I don't want to lease it. He's a real estate man. If you're a real estate and you're sort of working in New York and you see an empty block, but there's a few shops that's still going on in it, you know that actually what you need is ownership. Leases don't have the same, you don't have the same ability to manipulate people out of your way to build your next tower or whatever it is in that sense. So I think he wants to own it. Does it, is it strategically going to change anything? I think not really marginally, but it's happening anyway. I mean, the Arctic is becoming important, mainly because of the passages, the Northwest Passage and the passage through the Bering Straits and so on, because the ice is still there, but, and America isn't ready for it. Really, they have one icebreaker compared to Russia having about 14 that traverses it, and Russia has a much easier access. But Russia has already, anyway, said, during that Alaska meeting to Trump, and said, look, and I said at the time, I thought it was being held in Anchorage because Putin understood Trump's, business mentality orientation. He said, look, Trump, look around. Think, we could work together and, we could exploit the oil and the gas resources of the Arctic. Wouldn't that be great? It would be epic, wouldn't it? And, I'm sure, Trump and Witkoff's eyes will have sort of lit up, and money, billions, trillions, money. So I think, that it is really, the Greenland is one of the blights. Now, I want to say this because I think it's important about Iran, but also affects Greenland as well, and what happened in Greenland, and why I think your viewers will know the expression TACO, which is Trump always chickens out. TACO is an expression that has been in use for some time in terms of tariffs and other economic measures. Now, I think that there are two things that are quite important and new, which will affect the decision of whether there's another attack on Iran or not. The first one is a new poll out by the New York Times poll shows that the disapproval rating, not the approval, the disapproval rating of Trump has now reached 47%. This is really significant when you think, the Republicans probably, of those that vote, represent about 30% of the population. Another 30% by the Democrats, and the rest much more independent. But when you get up to that sort of disapproval ratings, it's not good look for midterms coming up at the end of the year. Not a good look at all. And we have clear indications that Trump is now increasingly not just anxious, but almost panicked. And he said, if we lose the House, and at the moment it looks as if they may well lose the House, maybe even the Senate too, but the House, he said, we're finished, we're finished, we're finished. So he's concerned about that. Now, the other thing about Greenland, which ties in, what changed the Greenland calculus? Was it the Europeans, the threats that they were making and their warning to use the trade bazooka, the European trade bazooka against America, which is a fatuous proposition because the Europeans have made themselves, they did this consciously and deliberately, totally dependent on the United States. I saw a figure recently that Germany is 96% dependent on liquefied natural gas from the US now. Used to enjoy the benefits of cheap pipeline Russian gas, but they have chosen as a deliberate decision to make themselves dependent now, completely dependent, really, because, I don't think Qatar or any state is going to sort of make up the balance if the Americans put pressure on Europe by stopping the supply of liquefied natural gas. So was it this that changed the Greenland calculus? Well, I'm not a psychiatrist, and so I can't tell you exactly what's on in Trump's head. But I think that if you had a look at it the same day, there was a near implosion in the bond market when he made the announcement of tariffs on European states that didn't approve his Greenland seizure. The bond market tanked. The last time it had tanked in the same way was on so-called Liberation Day. And if you remember, Besant had to fly to Mar-a-Lago quickly and say, for goodness sake, draw back on these sanctions. We need to, sustain. The fragility of the economic situation is something that is going to impinge on the Iranian equation quite clearly, because what happens if Iran is attacked and closes the Straits of Hormuz? What happens if the Gulf states are affected? What's going to be the bond market in respect? The bond market is much more, in my view, the constraint about what Trump is thinking, where he would like his next win to come from, his next, um, stunt after Maduro. But, is Iran a good bet for that? And I would say Iran isn't a good bet. Isn't a good bet in two things: in that this is not going to be a quick, even in the best of his scenarios, in his, the fantasies that have been suggested to him from Israel and others, that it could be quick in, out, and short, sharp, and a huge, huge win, and headlines, and it would look, it's not Venezuela. It's not going to be like that. In fact, it could be just the opposite. It could be long drawn out, it could be bloody, and it could extend, and there could be American casualties and infrastructure damage in a war with Iran. So I think he's going to have to take that. And so, what would be the impact on the bond market? Because I think geopolitics, I keep saying this, I think people look at me as if I'm a bit nuts, but I think the all of American geopolitics at the moment is about the debt situation and the bond market and the stock market. These are the key things. He needs the money flowing in. Anything that seems to impede it, like unexpected tariff wars and so on, unsettle a very nervous bond market where interest rates are not coming down, they're going up, and people increasingly are buying gold rather than putting their money into US treasuries. So I think the poll, the news and the poll and the prospects, that Trump wants, yes, he wants a win. Now, I think he may have had delusions that he could sort of, you know, Delta Force could fly in and grab hold of the Supreme Leader and have him on in the court in New York the following day. It's just absolute nonsense, a complete fantasy. All right, it worked, but it was worked because of completely different reasons in Venezuela. But it will not work at all. And I think possibly he's sort of grasping that. He needs, he's coming up. It's, I think, any time now is the anniversary of his inauguration, and then there's coming up the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Founding. I'm sure he wants, a big stunt, a stunt, that a standout event that, grabs the headlines, grabs the attention of all the world, and looks great and is clearly a win. So yeah, I think he wants that. I think Greenland was conceived in that vein. Something that could be done. I'll just buy it. Why not? I mean, this is fine. I think he may end up seizing it. By the way, I do think he may end up getting it because I think the Europeans will actually put pressure on Denmark. Look, do it. We do it because we need Trump, much as he's an awkward character, but we need him to back up our security guarantees in Ukraine. And when the forces go there, so it's all about Ukraine. So I think the pressure. Look, I mean, Denmark wasn't even consulted. I mean, they just sent Rutte in to say, and Denmark was plaintively saying, yeah, but he hasn't got a mandate. We didn't agree that he should negotiate on our behalf or on the Parliament's behalf. So I think probably he will get it, and it'll come up, and probably at the right time, Denmark will submit and agree a small fee for transferring sovereignty to the United States. I'm only guessing. I don't have any inside information, but that's how I read the situation. The Europeans, despite all of the angst and anxiety that they have displayed in Doha, don't want to lose daddy. They want to keep daddy in play, and they want still think they want to have him come and agree to, backstopping the Europeans if they, ever. Of course, I don't think they're likely to in the foreseeable future ever get a ceasefire, not on the terms that are being proposed, not but only on the terms that Mr. Putin has suggested in the June in the June of last year, 24.
Yeah. The other important things is the board of peace that Donald Trump is somehow excited about these all these countries coming together. When Donald Trump talks about peace, is it really about ending wars or reorganizing the world into rival military blocs?
Well, it could be actually as much about sort of business opportunities and real estate deals too, because all of these conflicts. Look at Gaza and all of the things that are mentioned. I mean, these the Kushner and others have got. Yeah, look at our plans. Skyscrapers, and there are great investment opportunities. It's going to give billions to the investors in this. So it seems as much about part of his Trump's said, his politics of not only transactional, but he sees politics as all about business, and this is one of the things that he has pursued in Russia, seeing that Witkoff and Kushner are there to that there needs to be all the stakeholders need somehow to get a payoff of one sort or another. The way you do geopolitics is you devise like a real estate deal. You devise a bit to, we have to buy out him, we have to buy out this other person there, we have to buy out the people by promising them a stake in the grift, which it is all grift. The vast, the huge amounts of money that'll probably be allocated for rebuilding and so on. Large parts of that will be sort of used, will somehow be the grease that allows some sort of settlement. That's how they see it. I don't see it like that. I think that Russia and Mr. Putin have got a very clear view that the root causes of the problem need to be addressed. And in his talk to the new ambassadors coming to present their credentials, I think at the end of last week, he made it very clear that the root problem is, as we all know, is the expansion of NATO, and that NATO needs to pull back. And that has to be agreed, not by a couple of businessmen, but has to be agreed formally, state to state, in a treaty or in a legal document, not in the way in which the, if you like, the end of the Cold War with in '91 was done verbally, and now people said to say to the Russians quite often, or have been saying, what was there some agreement that it would be not an inch further? Did you have that in writing? You know, and no, they didn't. And now, the present one is, Kushner, who I don't think he even is an official of the administration, and Witkoff, I don't know exactly what his status is. But both of them, do they have a mandate to come to some sort of terms with Russia, or not? Why isn't Rubio there? He's the Secretary of State. He's the one who would have to sign on. So I think that this business, everything business and stakeholders and buying off people is now being transferred into this peace process of his. But if you read, I don't, you should read the actual charter for it because it's quite clear. I mean, the whole thing is chaired by Mr. Trump. He appoints or not appoints or deselects the people who will be the members of this. It's not about Gaza. There is another piece, a subordinate piece. It's about Gaza, but the main, if you like, the main peace process is essentially about resolving conflicts and resolving issues wherever they arise, and that Trump will be the arbiter, and that people will contribute money, and the money will go to Trump, and he will decide how to spend it, and that it will take on many of the functions and roles of the United Nations, effectively, particularly the Security Council. So the Europeans are in a state of some high anxiety about this too. I mean, and because where does this leave? Trump has already says he doesn't believe there is such a thing as international law. So I mean, so what is the geopolitical, if you like, landscape composed of now? Just force majeure, just the ability to use force. Those who have strength will use it, and those who don't will have to suffer it. That is basically the sort of motto of this new structure. And so the Europeans, some of them are refusing to join it. They haven't come an agreement what to do. But with that, and then the question about NATO now. I mean, is NATO? They obviously put Rutte in to do the negotiations about Denmark to underline, the role of NATO and NATO continuing, because they are desperate for NATO to continue for all sorts of reasons. Not least is because it is a slush fund in Brussels. NATO has lots of money there, and they fund conferences and traps and fact-finding structures and things like this. It funds a lot of people's salaries and also their conferences and other things. So they're desperate to keep it.
The When it comes to the case of the peace, the board of peace as they call it, so board of peace as they call it, many people were somehow surprised by the attitude of the Russian president Vladimir Putin announcing that $1 billion goes to the board of peace to for the reconstruction of Gaza. And we know that if they take $1 billion from the frozen Russian assets, they have to release all of them. And it's not going to be you're going to take out 1 billion, that the rest going to be frozen, going to stay frozen. Is that the strategy on the part of Russians?
I, I look. I don't think. I think to call it a strategy is sort of overplaying it. I think he is sort of tongue in cheek stirring the pot in Europe, and as he put it, just letting the situation cook a bit, because of course the most of those resources, the frozen assets, are in Europe and European clear, and the Europeans weren't able even to get at them because the legal penalties for if you like unfreezing them or just seizing them were too great. So I think that was a little bit of stirring the pot by Putin, and also, because Europeans have imposed, a ridiculous sort of boycott of Russia. When there are G20 meetings that take place, where Russia does participate, or Lavrov or the foreign ministry participate, the Europeans, like, I'm afraid I have to say, rather like sort of school children, pretend not to shake hands or not to be able to shake hands with, Lavrov, probably the most eminent sort of diplomat there is at the moment, and pretend to sort of ignore him and don't, join in the discussions. So uh, I think Putin is saying yes. Well, Trump says I should come and join the board of peace. So why not? If it happens, why not? And that'll mean most of the Europeans will not be able to join it, probably, because they have a policy of ostracizing all Russians, and it's getting more and more fierce about the Russians that are being boycotted or not allowed to travel or sanctioned or excluded. So I don't think you should read a huge strategic significance in it. I think Putin probably sort of had a little smile on his face and said, "Okay, why not? Let's join it and see what that ripples out around Europe as a consequence."
Yeah.
I don't
Thank
know
you
that the
so.
border. I don't know that the border peace will really ever come to much. But anyway,
Because we
who knows?
only have two European countries being part of the board of peace, Hungary and Bulgaria, the two
That's
countries,
right.
and the rest. Yeah,
They've said no, but I mean, maybe Trump likes it like that. I mean, the Europe. He obviously does disdains the European leadership completely, from all the comments and the attacks that took place in Davos. Not from him particularly, but from parts of his team. I mean, there was a sort of walkout over dinner, over Howard Lutnick's, the Commonwealth Secretary's, comments at dinner. And so maybe he likes just to. I mean, he's the chair of it. He decides what the agenda is. He decides how the money is spent. He decides which issue to take on. He and the only one is the infamous Tony Blair, who will represent Europe, I suppose, on it. I mean, anyway, I mean, crazy world, isn't it? Crazy,
yeah,
crazy.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I think that was summed up by the Canadian Prime Minister saying that the rules-based international order is just over. I think
Well, yes, but he also put it in a different terms, which was even more interesting, because he went back to the early Soviet, and the writings of a Russian, well, actually, it was Polish, Havel Flack at the time, who was saying, what happened was that every day the shopkeeper came out and he put a little notice in his store saying, "Workers of the world unite." And he duly put it in his shop and went back and did business. And that just one day he didn't do it. And it wasn't as if he'd suddenly had a sort of dawn of lightning experience that showed him that this was no longer the case. Everyone had known for years that it was not the case, but nonetheless, everyone continued to put out the signs saying, "Workers of the world unite," when patently it wasn't going to ever happen. And then suddenly, when it was gone, said, I realized that the era had ended. And I suppose Carney has done something of the same. Everyone knew that, if you like, the rules based order was not a rules based order at all. It was just one that served the interests of the United States principally. But the Europeans loved to use the suggestion is that they had some moral um, superiority and moral values that they could lecture the rest of the world on. and that this came from the rules-based order, which was rooted in, values of the post-war era. And then suddenly the notice has been taken away and it's gone. And so everyone realizes, or at least now has to accept what they all knew, but didn't say.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Alastair, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as
Pleasure.
always.
I think. Thank you very much. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your time there and safe journey home when it happens.
Thank you.